what is the major problem with the Jesus mythicist idea? Well, it's that you either have to lie or misrepresent the data. Let's look at this.
I'm just going to ask you straight up, do we have any first century accounts of Jesus?
We don't.
So yes, we do have first century accounts of Jesus. Now we do have Paul, we have the Gospels. Now if you don't like those, I guess we can kind of push them aside, but there's really no reason to do that. Because the idea that just since they're Christian texts, we have to ignore them really makes no sense. We wouldn't do this with any other type of text, so why do we special plead here? But let's just do that. Let's push aside the books that are in the New Testament. We do have Josephus. He's a first century historian who talks about Jesus. And in fact, he's the only historian that we expect to even talk about Jesus. Why? Because he's the only one who actually cared about Palestine. If you look at this geographical area in the first century, no one talks about it. No one cares about this Palestinian area because it's kind of just a backwater area. It's something that doesn't matter to the empire. So in fact, we really don't have a lot of first century writings at all when it comes to Palestine. But the one historian that we would expect to have something, Josephus, does in fact talk about Jesus. But let's see how David Fitzgerald actually deals with this.
Let's talk about Josephus because this is a guy who died after Jesus was born and lived after Jesus was meant to have died.
So yeah, Josephus born and lived after Jesus supposedly died. But do you know who was living at the same time as Josephus? The brother of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, the early Christians. Josephus would have had access to a lot of these individuals. What Josephus also had access to were Jewish records because he was associated with the priests. He knew the high priests. He knew the people who led the Sanhedrin. He could have asked them about information. And in fact, when we look at historians, this is exactly what we're looking at. People who lived after the fact who are telling us about that history. So why is it a problem here? Well, because mythicists like this want to ignore everything that history tells us in order to come to their conclusion. Because if they actually looked at this as a historian would, they would not come to the same conclusion that they have.
He's got two passages that are supposedly talking about Jesus.
So yes, we have two passages within Josephus that talk about Jesus. Now, for historians, they don't really matter because when we actually look at the story of Jesus, we're looking at Paul, we're looking at the Gospels, because those are the texts that actually deal with him. And if we look at the Gospels, they are like ancient biographies. They fit within this category called bios or lives. And this is something that scholars generally agree on. When we look at other figures from that time period, say, Augustus, that's the same type of genre that is used to write about his life. So we're looking at sources that we should be looking at. The Gospels. Yes, they contain some things that are not historic. They contain some mythology, some theology, but that's what we see within this genre. If we, again, look at Augustus, we see mythology, we see theology, and that's just something that we expect in this type of writing, and we have to deal with it. And the way we deal with it isn't simply by throwing it out.
One is a forgery. No one denies it's a forgery. We all know it's a forgery.
Yeah, so no one actually calls it a forgery except Jesus mythicists. Those are the only people who really say it's a forgery. The vast majority of scholars say that there is a historic core there, and there's a few passages or a few lines that were added to it later on, that there's a couple interpolations to it. But we do have a new movement here within the scholarship in which they're actually arguing that the entire thing is authentic, but there's just a couple tweaks that you have to make because words were dropped. So one of the new books on this subject is by Joseph Smith, and it's just Josephus on Jesus. It's a book that's actually free to download, and it's a wonderful read. Now, he might go a little bit too far in some of his ideas, but what he's saying isn't really revolutionary. He's really taking the lead of other people, like Alice Wheatley. So the fact of the matter is that no, people don't consider it a forgery unless you're a mythicist. That's really the only people who dismiss it. To claim that everyone knows it's a forgery just means that you really haven't read anything on the subject.
I mean, the fact is, for 300 years, nobody knows about this passage.
Do you know what also doesn't happen within 300 years? No one actually really says anything about the Antiquities of the Jews at all. Like, no one cared about this work by Josephus. When we're looking at Christian writers, they're not using the Antiquity of the Jews. They're using other Josephus works. The Antiquity of the Jews simply doesn't come into play. And in fact, we really don't see a mention of it at all until about 300 years later, about the same time that we see Origen starting to use it, when we see Eusebius starting to use it. And that's because it just isn't an important work. And even when we do see this passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, being used in Eusebius, it's not to claim that Jesus is Christ or Jesus is the Messiah or anything about Jesus. It's being used to confirm a chronological idea. That's it.
The second passage is talking about a Jesus who isn't our Jesus at all. You just have to read the story. It tells you who they're talking about. It's not our Jesus.
So if we read this other passage, yes, it's about James, but how do they introduce James? Well, they do so by saying that he is the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, or who was called Christ. Now, who is this Jesus who was called Christ? Well, it's a throwback to the Testimonium Flavianum. That is the only other individual who's ever called Christ. It's just this one figure. So yes, this passage does tell us which Jesus they're talking about. And it's pretty specific. It's the one who was called Christ. So yeah, this is the historical Jesus that we're talking about. To say that it's talking about some other Jesus just doesn't make sense, because